Would you find in your Bibles John chapter 18? John chapter 18. I'm thinking about trying out for the Olympics. I finally found an event that I think I would be competitive in. It's a jumping event. It's not the long jump. That'd be too far for me. It's not the high jump. That'd be too high. It's a different event completely. It's the jumping to conclusions competition. Anybody here think they could maybe enter or give me a run for my money in the jumping to conclusions department? I mean, the pole vault's too high. You don't need a pole to do this jumping to conclusions. It takes little effort mentally to jump from wherever little bit of information that you hear to some conclusion. And usually when we hear some little bit of information, we jump to the worst conclusion possible. Wouldn't you agree with that? Whatever is the most negative, that's the one we go to. You're not physically exhausted. Now, Proverbs chapter 18 is something that helps counter my experience in this jumping to conclusions. Kind of helps me a little bit. Proverbs 18 and verse 13. He who answers a matter before he hears it, it is a folly and shame to him. Somebody speaks before they hear all the facts, before they have all the information. It's a foolish thing to do. Man, if we could just slow down and catch our breath, wait for some answers, ask some questions. Isn't that a beautiful sound? Paul's getting in on baby dedication next week too. Just love that sound. Babies crying. In the book of Acts, there's several times where there's mobs that rise up to harass the Christians, and in particular the Apostle Paul. And in one of those mob scenes, it's in Acts chapter 19 and verse 22 or verse 32. It says there, some therefore cried one thing and some another. And here, this is this mob scene again. For the assembly was confused, and most of them did not even know why they had come together. You've probably seen a mob scene on television, makes the news. And maybe you've even asked yourself, do they even know why they're there? Do they even fully understand what the issues are? Maybe you got caught up in something. A friend of yours posted some justification on Facebook, and you were like, I have got to defend them. They're exactly right. We don't even have to know all the answers. You shared a video because it was so unjust and unfair. And then later, you found out there were some other circumstances. There were some mitigating factors. That all the facts weren't out there right away. There was some rush to judgment. There was a jumping to conclusions. Anybody want to admit their expertise in jumping to conclusions? Anybody jumped, or shall we say, leapt before you looked? And then after you leapt, you realized, I think that might have overreacted. But now I'm committed. Now I'm going to have to follow through. Now I'm going to have to drive this train as far as I can because I've stuck my neck out. I've already made a fool of myself. To back off now is to expose my foolishness. I can't do that. He who answers a matter before he hears it, to him it is folly and shame. Jumping to conclusions, making an assumption, making a negative assumption that's unsupported by facts. But how we love to go there. It's an obstacle. It's an obstacle to communicating. It's an obstacle to emotional and spiritual health because we're making decisions, we're coming to conclusions that aren't supported by facts. We assume that one is right, and we look for some confirmation bias without actually knowing full information. So if you've jumped to conclusions at some point, just know that you and I aren't the first. When we go into Scripture and we look at Jesus' life, and we're at the point in our study of the Gospel of John, of Jesus' life, where a mob scene arrived at the Garden of Gethsemane and arrested Jesus. He's going to go through some trial experiences, and then the mob is going to be stirred up even more to where they're shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." And I think we could probably say that some in that mob did not even know why they were there, but somebody got them all stirred up. So last Sunday's message, maybe you were able to tune in. We talked about Jesus' arrest. Hundreds of soldiers showed up at the Garden of Gethsemane and arrested Jesus there. Today we're going to look closer at the rush to judgment from the people that were involved in his arrest. And maybe we could slow down a little bit, gather some information, ask some questions, maybe learn some facts before we rush to judgment. So John chapter 18 and 19 is our text for today. It's Jesus' arrest. I want us to understand the timeline a little bit. The chapters leading up to John 18 have been Jesus at the Last Supper with his 12 disciples. We could call it, sometimes referred to in the upper room, a borrowed second floor room where Jesus was at with his close followers. And he finished a 5-chapter conversation with them. It's included in John 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. We come to chapter 18, he goes to the garden and gets arrested. We don't know what time he left the upper room to go pray at the Garden of Gethsemane. We don't know what time that was. But we know that his crucifixion was 9 o'clock the next morning. So whatever time frame is involved, it's pretty cramped. The events that we're going to talk about today are crammed into a very narrow amount of time, not enough time to think through and process for the mobs of that day to actually come to wise decisions. It was a rush to judgment. So he met in the upper room with his disciples. He goes to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray. He's arrested. And then what follows are 6 trials. And I want to just give this little sense of those trials to you. If you want to jot those down, that would be helpful, I think, in you putting the night into perspective. So again, Jesus is forced to do an all-nighter because they arrest him after dark, and he goes through these 6 trials, and then the crucifixion takes place at 9 a.m. the next morning. So there were 2 parts to the trials. The first was the Jewish religious trial, and then there was the Roman civil trial. So under the Jewish religious trial, there were actually 3 hearings that took place. In John chapter 18, verse 12 and 13, it says this: "Then the detachment of troops and the captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. And they led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year." So the first hearing that Jesus is drugged to here late at night is to Annas, the former high priest. It says he's the father-in-law to Caiaphas, who's the current high priest. Now it seems to me if they drugged Jesus to him first, that he's the one that had the real clout. He was the one that carried all of the weight, if you will. And he seems to be letting his son-in-law be the high priest for that year. But Annas was the first guy. And then verse 24, look down there. "Then Annas sent Jesus bound to Caiaphas, the high priest." So the second trial, second hearing that takes place is there with Caiaphas, the high priest. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have more to say about the scene at Caiaphas's place. The third is what would be called the Sanhedrin. And I think we have it spelled out on the screen for you, the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was the Jewish religious body. There were 71 members of the Sanhedrin. The high priest was one of them. There was some kind of assistant high priest, and then 69 members. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, when we think about them, that's who made up the Sanhedrin. And so they took Jesus to the Sanhedrin as well. Matthew, Mark, and Luke record the events that took place at the Sanhedrin. Then we come to the Jewish civil trials, or the Roman civil trials. And the first one was with Pilate, Pontius Pilate. The most significant discourse between Jesus and any of these trials takes place between him and Pilate. Very fascinating study, Jesus and Pilate. And Pilate is at the Praetorium, the headquarters for Rome in Jerusalem. And that's in chapter 18, verse 28. It says there that they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the Praetorium, and it was early morning, and they themselves did not go into the Praetorium lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. So just a little detail, they moved Jesus to the Roman place of authority, but the Jews were so concerned about following the religious law that they wouldn't actually go in. They're demanding an innocent man to be crucified, but they don't want to break any rules by going into the Roman civil governmental authority place. So they meet with Pilate there, and then Pilate, if you look at verse 28, it said it was early morning. So this forced all-nighter of Jesus is taking place. Some of you may recall what Pilate did when he found out that Herod was in town. He sent Jesus over to Herod. And Luke 23 records Jesus and his time with Herod. That would be the fifth hearing or trial that happened there overnight. And then the sixth one, Herod sends him back to Pilate. Sends Jesus back to Pilate. And it's that time when Jesus says, "Who do you want me to release to you, Jesus or Barabbas?" And the mob is all stirred up. They don't even know what they're talking about. And they just yell, "Barabbas, give us Barabbas. What do you want me to do with Jesus? Crucify him, crucify him." They all yell. Now there's some significant irregularities, or we could say even illegalities, where the Jews were violating their own rules. In their efforts to follow all the rules, they're breaking a bunch of them. And I wanted to just pass along a few of them. One was that the judge needed to be impartial and actually stick up for the defendant. You think about it, in our country, defendants have a lot of rights. The burden is on the prosecution to successfully prove that the individual's guilty of whatever they're charged with. That would not have been the case in Jesus' hearing, because there was no impartiality on the part of those that were arresting him. Also, it only stands to reason that all court sessions would be held during the day. It wouldn't be held at night, overnight, 2 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning. I was thinking about the Sanhedrin, that crowd of 71 people. How do you think they all felt being mustered at 2 a.m. and having to show up at their meeting hall at the temple? How happy were they, right? They're ready to just, be difficult with anybody that was brought to them. Another one is that they were searching for witnesses. We got to find somebody that's going to make up stuff about this guy. And the witness's testimony never did agree. The witness's testimony didn't agree. In Mark chapter 14 and verse 56, Mark's version of this account, it talks about that many bore false witness against Jesus, but their testimonies did not agree. So somehow, in the middle of the night, overnight, they round up all these false witnesses and drag them into these hearings to tell about Jesus and make up stuff about him. And one of the things you want to look for, right? Does this witness agree with this witness who agrees with that witness? And none of that was happening here for Jesus. One more is there was no valid legal evidence that was brought against Jesus. No, here's Exhibit A, look what he did and said. Here's Exhibit B, these witnesses saw this. None of that was going on. But it's the conversation between between Pilate and Jesus, that most captures my attention. It was 3 years ago that we did a message study. You can go back to the church app and you can look back at those messages, where we took each individual statement of Pilate's made to Jesus or about Jesus and the significance of those statements, but I want to take 4 of them this morning and talk about them for just a couple of moments, because really they boil down to identity questions. Jesus has Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, the man in charge, questioning himself, questioning reality, wondering who's standing in front of him, asking identity questions. Now, all through the Gospel of John, we have seen this issue come up. Who are you? That question is asked about Jesus over and over and over. Who are you? Who are you? Outsiders are asking it of Jesus. John, the writer, is answering the question by saying, Jesus is the bread of life. Jesus is the light of the world. Jesus is the true vine. So they seek to answer that question. But in our series about the Gospel of John, we've asked the question, who are you? And we've said that the answer to that question always must start with God. And that when people are asking the identity questions, we've got to start with God. We can't start with ourselves. We're too small of a person, and the world is too big to start with ourselves as the starting point. So again, let me remind you, there were 2 power structures taking place at this time. The Jewish religious power structure that was governing civil and religious life. There was the Pharisees and the Sadducees and such. And these Jewish religious leaders had been on the hunt for Jesus. They'd been looking to take him out for months, if not a few years. In John chapter 5, it's in verse 16, it talks there, for this reason, this is way back in John 5, for this reason the Jews persecuted Jesus and sought to kill him because he had done these things on the Sabbath. They sought to kill him. John 11:53, which was just a week or so before this arrest of Jesus. Then from that day on, they plotted to put him to death. So these 2 power structures are going on. The Jews' civil life, and they're out to get Jesus. And then there's the Roman political life, was the other power structure. They were aloof from the day-to-day activities of the Jews. As long as everything was peaceful, as long as the Jewish authorities were handling things, then the Roman authorities were good, and Pilate could just let things be. But now this Jesus gets dropped on his doorstep. Things get stirred up. It's not so simple anymore. It's a lot more complicated. So Pilate says multiple things to Jesus. We're going to look at 4 of them. I want to just point out 4. One is in chapter 18, verse 33. 18, verse 33. Look what it says there. Pilate entered the praetorium again. He called Jesus and he said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" The first thing Pilate asks Jesus is an identity question. Are you the king of the Jews? Who are you? It's what people of that day were asking. And it's the ultimate question. Who is Jesus? Because only as we make sense of who Jesus is do we make sense of who we are. Now, why does this question really matter? Why is this the ultimate question? Because so many in our culture in our day are saying, well, who am I? And they look in the mirror and they're trying to figure out their identity, and identity is confusing and they might change their identity. Who is Jesus? That's the question. And that's the question for at least 3 reasons. I want to pass along. 1, it gives us a starting point. It gives us a starting point. You see, if you start with yourself, you're going to quickly run into a problem. And that problem is called reality. Because nobody else is starting with you as the starting point. So let's just say you're in a room with 12 people and you're starting with yourself. Who am I? Well, who am I in relation to what's going on around me? But what are the other 11 people in the room doing? How are they generally starting their question? If all 12 people in the room start with themselves, something will have to give somewhere. There's going to be some conflict. You want to know why there's a lot of conflict in our world? Because people are starting with themselves as the determiner of their identity, and that brushes up against reality because nobody else is starting on that level. It starts with God. That's it. When we align ourselves with God and we ask, who is Christ? That is the starting question. Secondly, it aligns us with reality. There's a creator God that made this physical universe. He invented gravity and mass and time and space. You didn't do that, and I didn't do that, and we didn't do that. But there is a God that did. The third reason why it matters asking that question is it gives us a basis for decision making. It gives us this framework, a scaffolding, a structure for decision making. We don't have to invent it. We don't have to make up moral values. We don't have to discover or figure out how does the universe work. It's all right there. God lays out for us in the Word of God. Here's how a moral universe works. Here's what makes sense. Here's how you align your life with reality. And here's the decision-making process on finances, on sexuality, on relationships, on vocation and calling. Here's how you align your life with reality, and you can make decisions based on that structure, on that scaffolding. If you begin with yourself, what tends to happen is there's all these multiple expressions of the same inner confusion. And so many times when people start with themselves, expressing themselves in all these different patterns, it's really the same issue being expressed. And then they end up saying things like, why can't I just find a good guy? Why do I keep making the same mistake over and over again? Why does this stuff always keep happening to me? And the answer is because the framework for decision making, you're building your own scaffolding, and your reality isn't the same as the reality. So when Pilate said to Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" That was the first thing out of Pilate's mouth to Jesus, trying to make sense of his identity. Because only when we make sense of who Jesus is do we make sense of who we are. Pilate says something else. It's in verse 38. Let me read verse 37. Pilate therefore said to Jesus, "Are you a king then?" And Jesus answered, "You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I've come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Then Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, "I find no fault in him at all." So Jesus' response to the question, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus is trying to explain to him, hey, there's a reality that doesn't start with you, Pilate. I came to bear witness to the truth. And that sets up the whole scaffolding, the whole framework for decision making. And that brings Pilate to say, what is truth? Now he's questioning his own framework for decision making. What is truth? How do I make sense of reality? You see, what is truth is that which conforms to reality. What's my starting point? The starting point, that's why when the scriptures say, in the beginning God, he's giving us the starting point. Now this verse 38 gave us a third statement from Pilate that I think is a big deal. He went out to the Jews and he said to them, I find no fault in him at all. The same phrase occurs in chapter 19, verse 4, chapter 19, verse 6. I find no fault in him. 3 times. Why would Pilate say 3 times to this Jewish mob that's rushing to judgment, I don't see anything wrong here. I don't see any problem. They're yelling outside the palace, crucify him, give us Barabbas. And he says, I see no fault here. You know, when a jury is given a task here in the United States, their task is to declare or decide if the person is guilty or not guilty. A jury is never given the task to declare somebody innocent. What would be the difference between not guilty and innocent? The reality is none of us are really innocent, are we? Except one. There's only ever truly been one to whom we could say, I find no fault in him. They put me on trial. If I'm ever on the trial, they'll be like, well, it might not be this crime, but he's probably guilty of something. But Jesus, he didn't say not guilty. He said, this man is innocent. He's done nothing. I find no fault. Now he's trying to slow the mob down. He's trying to give the mob pause. Could we all take a breath? Could we ask some questions? Could we slow down? Could we maybe do this thing legally? We come to chapter 19 and verse 10, another statement from Pilate. And I encourage you to go back through this text and the other gospel accounts and find all the things Pilate said to and about Jesus. Very fascinating dialogue. Then Pilate, in verse 10, said to Jesus, are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have power to crucify you and I have power to release you? We'll pause there. I'm going to read verse 11 in a minute. But this is Pilate, the Roman governor, talking to the creator of the universe. And he says, don't you know I have power? Think of some scenario where there's like a small child, maybe like when my 4-year-old said to me once, you're not the boss of me. Some little scenario like that. And that's Pilate talking to Jesus. Don't you know I have power? But it's the mouse talking to the elephant. We're looking at the scale, the difference here. So verse 11, Jesus answered, you could have no power at all against me unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin. Pilate's equilibrium is completely out of whack because he dared to ask the question, who are you, Jesus? He's completely off balance. He's questioning reality. What is truth? The mob's condemning him. The mob is yelling. And so Pilate's equilibrium is completely messed up. So he goes to the only thing that a Roman really understands, and that's power. It's like his last resort. Romans think power, consolidated in the office of the Caesar, the emperor. And so he goes to the only cause he knows, what he has left. The last shred I have to hang on to is my power. Don't you know I have power? And Jesus gives him such a great answer. The only power you have is borrowed power. The only power you have is on loan to you. The only power you have is by permission for a time. Now, parents, sometimes you need to just power up on your kids and tell them, because I said so. And they look at you and they are like, don't you know that I have power? And you need to remind them who the real power of the family structure is. But also let's recognize that any power that you have is by permission from God, and it's temporary. 18 years or so. If somebody's in some boss supervisory role, any power or clout that you have in that position is by permission from God and is temporary. Anybody that's in a governmental role, you've been given that power and authority by permission, and it's temporary. It calls for humility. It calls for a stewardship, a recognition that this is a responsibility from God. This isn't something that we just power up and throw around. This is responsibility from God that I must steward well. Don't you know that I have power? We'd be very wise to carry any power that we have with humility and with stewardship, recognizing our own accountability. Let me close with a couple of thoughts related to this rush to judgment. How do we avoid that? How can we get to a place where we can avoid a rush to judgment? Now, Pilate surrendered to the mob scene. Despite his 3 efforts to say, I find no fault in him, he ultimately surrendered. I don't know if you've ever been, you have been called by telemarketers. They'll start in the affirmative. So I got one the other day. I think it was the big ice day, maybe, and they knew everybody would be around home. So I got the call. So this person was very persistent, and they really wanted to sell me their product or their timeshare or whatever it was. So I said, no, I'm not interested. And they just rolled. I said, no, I'm not interested. They just rolled. And I said, no, I'm not. I said, I'm now at 3 times. You've gotten 3 no's from me. How many do you need to get? And they're just rolling. They don't even hear me. And I said, I don't want to hang up on you. It's rude. I know you're just trying to earn a living for your family. And this is, the job you got. I'm sorry that you have this job. And they're just rolling. I said, okay, I'm going to say no a 4th time, but that's going to mean I'm going to have to be rude and hang up on you. Now, Pilate got 3 no's. I find no fault in him. I find no fault in him. And the mob didn't settle down. But he didn't go to number 4, and he didn't hang up on him, and he didn't shut the door, and he didn't release an innocent man. He surrendered to the mob. And a lot of times we've rushed to judgment, and we've surrendered to some mob scene without really thinking things through. This rush to judgment consumed him. Some of us have been caught up in some cause that consumed us. It confirmed our bias, told us what we wanted to be true, and we leapt. We jumped. And now our emotions are out there, and now we have to save face, so we got to ride the wave, ride that emotion. Somebody's venting. We didn't have all the facts, but that didn't matter. So how can we avoid this? How do we avoid this emotional living, this emotional roller coaster? 4 prayers. 4 prayers. Prayer number 1, God, would you make me a fork in the road? God, make me a fork in the road. To switch word pictures just a little bit, I would say it like this. Some of us are very much thermometers that reflect the environment around us. We, in fact, reflect other people's moods. And some of us are thermostats that determine what mood we're going to have, much less those close to us. Thermostats lead the way. Thermometers live in such emotional turmoil. Thermometers never have peace. Make me a fork in the road, God, that other people have to decide, that other people are deciding what they think of you, that other people are deciding about who you are. I don't want to be the emotionally reactive one. I want to be the strength individual. Second, God, would you give me wisdom to ask questions? Give me wisdom to ask questions. Nearly every situation, there's a fact or two that if we knew it, it would change our whole outlook. And you've been there because you've watched some video and you reacted and you were strong and you were on board and it was wrong, and then you found out a little bit something else. Oh, wish I'd have known that before I went off on things. Do you remember Pilate's first words to Jesus? Are you the King of the Jews? That was in chapter 18, verse 33. Look at chapter 18, verse 34. Jesus answered Pilate, are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me? What did Jesus do? He asked a question. He didn't get caught up in the emotion of this. He created a little emotional distance, emotional separation. He asked a question. Remember when some mob was trying to stir Jesus up? Hey, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Remember what Jesus said? Bring me a coin. Whose picture is on that coin? He asked questions. The mob was wailing. His friend Lazarus was dead, and Jesus says, where have you laid him? He already knew the answer to that. But he asked questions to slow things down, to gain a little bit more control. Imagine if you delayed your rush to judgment by asking more questions. Third, God, give me patience to avoid labels. God, give me patience to avoid labels. Here's what I mean by that. As soon as something happens, we label it good or bad. We don't even have all the facts. We don't even have the situation. It hasn't even played out yet, but we're immediately labeling it good or bad. One of my most helpful stories in this, I've told it over the years. Max Lucado wrote about a Brazilian woodcutter way up in the hills that he was very poor, and he had a horse and a son. And people would come to him and they would say, sell your horse, and then you'd have some money, you could buy some things. And he just was a simple woodcutter. He'd cut a little wood and sell it and get by. And then one day the horse ran off. And everybody came back to him and said, look how bad this is. We told you you should have sold your horse. This is so bad. Now you don't even have your horse. And he said, why do you say it's bad? I don't know if it's good or bad. It just is. The horse is gone. Why do you need to hurry and label it? A week goes by. The horse comes back, bringing 10 stray horses with it. Everybody comes back to him. Hey, this is great. You were right. This is really good. Look at all the extra horses. Man, you could train them. You could break them. You could sell them. This is great news for you. He said, I don't know if it's good or bad. It just is. So his son is breaking the horses. Gets thrown off the horse. He breaks his leg. Everybody comes back to the woodcutter. Oh, this is bad. You're right. These horses were bad news. They were trouble from the start. He's like, I don't know if it's good or bad. It just is. His leg's broken. That's the fact. Why do you insist on labeling this? Because once we label it, it becomes this whole defining thing. Well, then, whoever the ruler of the land was rolls into town, and they're rounding up an army. They got to go fight the bad guys. They're crowding us, heading toward the boundary line. Well, his son has a broken leg. He can't go. All the other able-bodied young men in the village, head off to fight in the war, and everybody comes back to the old man and says, this is great. Your son's leg is broken. You were right. Look how good this is. He doesn't have to go. The man says, why do you insist on labeling that? We don't know if it's good or bad. It just is. And in our rush to judgment, we are so quick to assign. Now, I understand categories help us deal with things. If I put this in the good category, then I can operate out from a good perspective. Put this in the bad category, I can operate on the bad category. But putting it in categories so fast We don't ever have to wrestle with things, or we don't ever have to grow and mature. It's just in these boxes. It seems simpler, but usually it's a rush to judgment that labels those things. And the fourth one is this: God, give me the resolve to trust your plan. Give me the resolve to trust your plan. I don't know if this is good or bad. I just know it's in your plan because it happened. I don't know if it's good or bad. I'm not going to jump on that conclusion. I just know you have a plan and a purpose. And I just know I need to trust you with that plan and purpose. Now, this mob is rushing to judgment. This mob is jumping to conclusions. And the whole time, God is working out the plan of salvation. There's one person in this scene that's not panicked. And that's Jesus. The disciples run in fear. Pilate's wife gets up and says, I'm troubled, have nothing to do with this man. I had a bad dream about him. But there's one person trusting God to be working a plan. Oh, if we could get to that place. Whatever circumstances have happened already in this very short year, and no doubt will happen for you in the months to come. If we could avoid labeling those things, rushing to some kind of judgment, jumping on some emotional bandwagon, and we could say, God, you have a plan. I trust your plan. Would you bow your heads with me, please? God in heaven, how we need to trust you and your plan. You have a purpose. You know what you're doing. Weather delays concern us. Medical situations concern us. Validating ourselves in the eyes of others is so concerning to us. Yet you have this purpose and plan, and how we need to find strength in that. We need to find resolve to trust. In Jesus' name.